Today I'm just going to show you a very quick way to access the Revit API and create elements in Revit just through using Python in Dynamo. And it's a very quick example, in this case making some walls based on some lines that we've got as an input. And this is useful in case you have some elements in Dynamo that you can't find or that don't work as you want them to. And you can literally create anything in the Revit API. So anything, any beams, columns, walls, anything you like. Okay, I've just got a blank Revit file and a new Dynamo script. I always set it to manual, which is better if you start making mistakes, especially if we're going to start using the API of Revit. And I'm just going to set up some points by coordinates. Defaults to 0, 0, 0, so I'm just going to leave that as it is. The next one, I'm going to make 1000 in the X and Y direction. So if I run that, I've got my 2 points. You can see it in the Revit window as well. And then I'm just going to set up a line between those points. So that's going to be my wall line. That's how Revit creates walls. It uses a baseline and then a height and some other parameters if you want to add them. So now that I've got my line, the other things I'm going to need is the level. So if I just start typing level, I can extract the levels from the Revit file that have already been set up. In this case, I've got base and level 1, 2. I'm going to start on base, which I know is at elevation 0, by the way. And wall types. And again, this just selects the wall types that I've already got built into the file. And I've set one up called 250, and that's a 250 thick structural wall. I've already got that defined in this Revit file. And the last thing I'm going to give it is a height, which I'm just going to do by typing it in. So I'm going to make it, say, 2 meters tall. And that's just a number. Okay, now we've got the inputs we need to create a wall. We're just going to go into the script part of Dynamo library, editor, and a Python script. And we're going to have 4 inputs, 0 to 3. Now if I just double click on that, you've got some stuff already in the node that's the absolute bare bones that you're going to need. But there is some additional code that we're going to have to add to access the Revit API. And I've got them here. So if you want, you might want to pause the video while I'm doing this at some point. But I'm just going to literally copy and paste this stuff in and explain as I go. So the first one is the Revit services. So that just allows us to access the Revit document manager, which is part of the API that controls Revit. By default, you don't even get that. You've just got some very basic library that allows you to manipulate geometry. So much like the first one, you've got to clear the reference and then import the services. And we're also going to import the document manager, the transaction manager, and we're going to define this variable called doc, which is the current document. So I've just literally copy and paste that in. You can see in the Python script that it recognizes the key syntax and colors things. The next thing we're going to have to add is the Revit API. So this allows us to access the API commands. And the next thing is the Revit nodes. And I want two things out of that. One's the Revit elements and one's the Revit geometry conversion. So I'll explain why I need both of them in a minute. So now that we've got them in, we've got a basic script, but no code, but it'll have the right libraries in it. Okay, the next part of it is we're going to get the inputs from Dynamo that we've set up, lines and levels and wall types, etc. So you can see it's called them a specific thing in 0 to 3 in square brackets. So I'm going to delete that basic code and I'm going to start calling things some names. So I'm going to call the lines and that's going to be equal to the input number 1 or input 0. The next one's going to be level, and that's going to be in 1. Now, because it's a level that's come from a node, we're going to have to do something else to this input, and that's unwrap elements. And all this does is it's a bit complicated, but Python is inside Dynamo and Dynamo's inside Revit. So unwrap elements just strips all of that away and just gives literally the underlying level information that we need, rather than a level that's wrapped inside Dynamo that's wrapped inside a Python script, if that makes sense. And type is going to be the same. And it's going to be in 2. And now the one that I've got to explain a little bit, which is height. And the reason we've got to do a little bit more work on height, even though it's just a number, is that often the API defaults to feet and inches, I believe, or units that I'm not using. I'm using metric. So there is a way of converting an input into metric, and that's this command, unit utils. If I type that with a dot, it comes up with some options, and I've got convert to internal units. So I can just double click that, and then again it's my fourth input. This takes 2 arguments. So the first argument is the input. The second argument is what type of units to use. And that's display unit type dot. And then you've got all your different unit types. And I'm going to use millimeters because that's what I normally use in Australia. Whoops, milliamperes. Millimeters. Okay, that's it. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to set the output to nothing, an empty list. You might not have to do that, but that's just safety thing. Okay, now onto the code, and initially that's literally 4 lines of code to create a wall. So pretty as basic as you can get, really. But there is a bit of syntax to go with it. So transaction manager dot instance. Here we go. And then there is a command which is ensure and transaction. And I'm going to define that as doc, which is what we defined up here. Then we're going to make a wall, and I'm going to just call it wall, and it's going to be equal to wall.create, and then we've got some variables to use. Now the way to find the reference to what to write here is there's a good site called Revit API docs.com, and I can just type in wall, something I want to create. I'm using 2020, so it's got the wall class. I'm going to go to wall methods, create, and you can see in Revit you can create a wall in 5 different ways, and it's got what you have to supply. So the most basic one, you can just say the document, which in our case is called doc, a list of curves, and a boolean, and the boolean just tells it if it's structural or non-structural. So that's the very most basic. But because I want to tell it the wall and the height and other things, I'm going to use this method here. And if I use that, I can click on this and find out more info. You can see it needs a document, which is the doc that we defined before, some curves or wall lines, element ID, level ID, which we've got both of those, a height, which we've got as well, an offset, which I'm going to say is 0. You can flip the wall with a boolean, or and you can define whether it's structural or not, which I'm always going to say it is. So if I go back to my code, I've got doc, I've got the lines, which I called lines up here as our input. I've got, and one last thing you have to do is say the lines have to be converted to Revit type lines. So this is one of the things you have to do with code is the raw lines are wrapped what Dynamo thinks is a line, but we want a Revit type line because we're talking directly to the Revit API. So this dot to Revit type just converts a Dynamo type of line into a Revit type of line. You can think of it that way. Then you've got your type, and I want the ID of the type. So type ID, because we've just taken the type in as our input, but we want the ID of it. Whoops, and it's capital ID, by the way. The next thing is the level, capital ID. Then you've got height, which we defined before, which is now in millimeters. Then you've got your offset, I'm going to call that 0. Then you've got your whether you'll flip the wall or not, and I'm going to say no, and whether it's structural or not, and I'm going to say yes. Okay, so that's our wall creation. And now I'm going to say I want my output, which I called up as a blank before. I'm going to append what I just called wall to the output. So the output is now wall, basically. And last thing, transaction manager dot instance dot transaction task done. Whoops, I got a double A in there. And our out is called output. Save. And I've just realized a mistake. Instead of convert from internal units, it should be convert to internal units. Okay, let's see if it works. Lines, level, wall type, height. Yep, there we go, there's a wall in 3D. There it is. And it's my basic wall 250. Now it's cool that we've got that working, but most of the time you don't want to just be creating one wall at a time. So I want to have a node that I've made that can convert multiple walls all at once from multiple lines. So to do that, I'm first going to quickly create a second line. I'll just make it in the X direction only. Just move these down. Whoops. I've got 2 lines. I'm just going to make a list of lines. First line, second line. Now if I plug that into our existing script, it wouldn't work. So I've got to make a new script, but this one's going to be much more useful than the first one. So to do that, I just copied and pasted. I'm going to put my list into it. Firstly, I'm going to just freeze off this one so that it doesn't run anymore. And with my new component, which has a list of lines rather than just one line, I'm just going to open that up and I'll show you how you can modify it to take a list rather than just one item. So it's pretty easy. All we need to do is set up a loop for the list so that it loops through the list and makes a wall for each item. And for that, I'm just going to do a for loop, and I'm going to call it for I in lines. And you've got to put a colon there. So for each line, it's going to go through them one by one and do the following things. And that's our existing command that we'd already used. This time, so I've been playing around with it already, but that used to be lines, but now that's got to be I, because it's referring to I as it loops through. And the other part of the loop is to append that wall. So it's going to loop around for each line, make a wall for each line, which it calls I, and append that wall element to the output. So the output's going to have a list of items as well. That's all you need to do. So if I save that, if this runs, it should create, and I'm just going to delete this wall, it should create 2 walls. Yep, done. So now we can make as many lines as we want, and as many walls as we want. And if you remember, if we go back to the API, we can do anything we want with this script. We can flip the walls, or we could have offsets for the walls. We could make the offset a new input for our script. You can do anything you like. So the advantage being that you're using the raw Revit commands rather than what's supplied in Dynamo, because Dynamo has a wall creation method as well. By curve and height and all this sort of stuff. But this just gives you much more power on what you want to do exactly. I've had to do this in the past because there's just the Dynamo default commands or default nodes just don't have certain things I want to do. Sometimes they only do single items, like our first script, and I have to make a new component for myself which does multiple items, so a list of items. And there's other components that don't exactly do what you want. But if you're able to write the actual to the API itself, you'll be able to do what you need to do. And I suppose the last thing to say is that unfortunately, even though it'd be good, we can't rename these inputs and make it look a bit nicer. Although I can rename the node, create wall. I can't do much more than that, and I can't even rename the output or even have more than one output. So that's a bit unfortunate with Python. If you do it with C# or other languages, you might be able to do that, but not with Python that I know of. Thanks for watching this structured parametrics video. Leave a like or subscribe if you found this useful, and we'll see you in the next one.